Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Let's Debate, where I, your disheveled goblin host, pose a question to my audience, and you respond with your takes on the matter. It's a great conversation. Usually we end up solving great world problems. It's pretty fascinating. Before we get into it, though, two quick things. One, why didn't I make this a Halloween-themed debate? Two, I am actually having my Halloween special drop tomorrow, so it would mean a lot if you guys watch it. It's a little short film, had some fun with a photographer friend of mine. It was his first doing something like this, my first doing something like this. It's amateur, for sure, but I think we did a pretty good job, and I'd recommend you check it on out. See a booktuber try and make a short film. There you go. Now, a quick word from today's sponsor. Hey, I'm really tired of just not gaining some skills I can share with people. Then I bet you're gonna like the sponsor of today's video. Why is that? Because it's Skillshare! Skillshare is an online learning community where you, for as little as $10 a month if you use the annual subscription plan, less than a lot of streaming services that will then go on to charge you to even watch movies they're putting on. No. Absolutely no. Bad Disney. But instead of watching the latest Disney film, you can start bettering yourself through this platform and expand your horizons into new directions, whether it's a career path or just a hobby you'd like to pick up. Hey, you want to learn coding? They got classes for that. You want something a little more artistic? Bam! Robert's got you covered. You got an iPad you don't use enough? He can help you use it more to have fun illustrations. You know how you guys made fun of me for those Dresden drawings? I'm gonna become such a good artist now. This is an online learning community. There's comment sections, engagement. You can start a new adventure and work that brain into being a sharper tool than ever. For the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description down below, you will get a free trial to Skillshare. And that's just super dim dare exciting. Go ahead and give it a go like many from the community already have, and back to the video. Authors need to get more comfortable with showing main characters who are actually a part of a different culture distinct from our own. Protagonists often sacrifice potentially interesting new perspectives for relatability, becoming the generic relatable white boy, who possesses largely the same values as the audience. I'd like to see more protagonists who aren't just a bundle of modern sensibilities. I'd like to see a protagonist deeply entrenched in a religion or have prejudices that make sense to their upbringing, or just speak and internally monologue a little different from a modern person. This is definitely something we see a lot of, just modern values taken, uplifted, and put in like a culture or setting that it's like, that doesn't necessarily feel like it would fit with the time and world you're building around it. It's actually part of that advice I gave in my world building video, where I said, like, try to write from multiple perspectives in your world and really see how the details come to life. And those are the kind of things you'll begin to realize, like, oh, it doesn't make sense for this person who's a farmer to actually not, be violently against this other group of people because of the position they're in. It's just difficult. I feel like it's an additional task. It's more weight on an author to be like, oh, I need to try and make this character likable or get people to invest in them when they don't share their modern, moral perspectives and everything. And when you're trying to write a character who's coming from that, it's rather difficult. I know. I'm writing a main character, spoiler warning for my book, main character in my book murders children. This is something where it's like, oh, they're that kind of monster. This goes far beyond what people normally think. Even violence wasn't normally the focus of criminal convictions back in medieval times. If you robbed a guy and you stabbed them during that robbing, most of the time they wouldn't care that much about the stabbing. Now, obviously, if that occurs, the big focus is the point that hey, you stabbed somebody. And I'm trying to get people to be invested in them because it makes sense in a way for the awful, awful, horrific beliefs they have. But I'm trying to contextualize in this setting, it does make sense to them, so try and digest that. So I can tell you from experience, this is not easy to do. We need more pre-medieval fantasy. More fantasy is moving towards the future, but prehistoric Mesopotamian stories are few and far between in the fantasy community. As a student in ancient history with a focus on Babylon, I know that there are stories to be told from this period or traditions that could be implemented in a magic system. Human development started here, so why no stories from here? P.S. Forgive my English, it's not my first language. You did amazing for English not being your first language. Congratulations. You definitely speak a second language better than I ever will. You're impressive. And I also almost completely agree with this point. We are seeing the trend generally push fantasy more towards the future, and there is a ripe field for the reaping of prehistoric cultures as well. Going all the way back to like river civilizations, I think there's plenty to be written there, and not a ton of authors are doing it. I don't have a counter, man. You just made a good point. What am I supposed to? I'm not gonna lie. No, you're wrong. There's no history to be pulled from. You did too good a job. I need bad takes. Give me a bad take. I want to see more refugee, more prisoner of war, more migration caused by war. Virtually every fantasy world has war in it, and thousands of people die in it, and many others migrate in order not to die. I think migration and waves of war refugees should be more common, and also a great way to introduce different cultures and values to the main ones where the main character belongs. God damn! Another really good one. I don't have a counter here. Yeah, it's a fact of history that these people who are always talking about realism in their fantasy haven't been complaining enough about, because it's a very real part of it. And a lot of series just kind of like will mention like, oh yeah, there's a lot of refugees, but they don't actually like deal with it or go into the incredible task of managing these people and trying to provide for them, because it's not an easy thing, or go into the unbelievable ramifications of not providing for these people and just letting them unfortunately go away, which has happened in history many times. So yeah, that's another damn good point. Though I will say, I don't necessarily want to read this, because after reading so many sad books recently, and 2020 being 2020, I'm tired, man. Oh God. Fix American culture first. Give me 1 second here. Chill, dude. History that is taught in schools isn't always true history. Exactly. People who write the history books have agendas. Things get forgotten and cultures change, so that thing said even just 100 years ago sounds foreign to us today. Too many sci-fi fantasy books don't allow history to be so flexible, but instead make it rigid, perfectly remembered account of the past. So here I'll push back in one specific way. I think the idea of history being so flexible is more of a modern concept, because I don't think back then people were aware of how inaccurate this could be. I'm not an expert in this, so don't quote me on it. And actually, the more I thought about this take, I can think of many examples with fantasy books and or series where like history's not right, and that becomes a huge point of contention where they have to like push back on the fact that what's been told to them isn't true. That's actually like a trope of fantasy. Two things. One, I feel like fantasy books tend to not have any cultural clashes in them, which I feel like as a focal point of plot, or even just a main point, would be very interesting to read. The Wheel of Time wants to talk to you. Many fantasy books have the characters acclimate to a culture super fast, to the point where it feels like the characters go, wow, an interesting weird culture place. This is very different from the fam I grew up with anyway. Two, fantasy histories tend to have like 3 events, and no one cares about what happened in between then and now. I don't know exactly how to fix this, because I also don't want a whole chapter dedicated to explaining the royal lineage or the fallout of one specific war, and how that doesn't even relate to the struggles the characters are going through. But it does bug me just a little. Well, the obvious answer to number 2 is to pull a Tolkien and release the Silmarillion. It's not necessary to your narrative, just put it in your little Bible. Bam! I actually totally agree. I actually have the same conflict with the second point here. As for the first one, this does happen quite a bit, but I can also see narratively as an author, you don't want to necessarily tackle the struggles of like cultural acclimation, which should be something that would be very difficult and time consuming to get into if you're trying to like have a steady pace for like a one-off book that you're trying to just like get on through. Like it become difficult. So for this one, I'm kind of like, yeah, I see the problem, but I don't know, because you have to remember, these people need to tell good stories. I don't know how relevant to the story it'd necessarily be. So it's kind of tricky. It's up to the author's intent. This is more of a random take, but I would like to discover more about the food and music behind a sci-fi fantasy culture. There's already a decent amount of info on art, architecture, and warfare. Could we include small stuff in our high fantasy epic to account for delicacies and ingredients that go into our characters' favorite dishes or musical taste? It would just make for an interesting bit of nuance, and I know in real life I discover a lot more about people after discovering their taste behind their culture. Ooh, I'm all for food and fantasy. I want to make that very clear. That's part of my foundational platform as like a person who reads. more food in your writing. I like reading about food. I don't know if that's weird or not, but I do. It just adds like, oh, I want to eat a snack now while I'm reading. Maybe it's a bad thing. But I do also understand there's a certain level of difficulty to write something like conveying the tunes and sounds of a culture's music. It's kind of like, and so if you're an author, especially like someone who's kind of struggling with that thing, I could see leaving it out, but I would always encourage people to include it because those little nuances to culture I just find so luscious. People say they want different cultures and perspective in books, but then never actually read books from other countries or authors that have unique perspectives. People want popular authors to write books with unique cultures and religions, rather than making already existing books more popular. Fix translations issues and will be opened up to so many amazing books. Yeah, I mean, you're dead on right here, but I'm also not going to be mad at people who are looking at their favorite authors and saying, hey, I'd like to see this from you, because, you know, they're allowed to say that. But I would also encourage those people to look into books from other cultures and read them. I've been aggressively trying to do that recently, trying to find an Indian fantasy book I can vibe with that I like. Unfortunately, I've had 2 bad experiences so far, but like, you know, I'm going to keep trying because I want to expand my horizons. And it's tricky, right? It's really, you never want to be in a position where you're telling people like, you can't want this from someone, but at the same time, yeah, guys, like read stuff from other countries. It's fascinating. Going back to the tired old well of medieval Western European culture for inspiration for fantasy is not a lazy thing if you're from that culture. It's also not a lazy thing if you're not from that culture. It's as much as the heritage of a 12-year-old European kid as it is to Tolkien. The latter just happened to get there first. Every other young writer's aspirations shouldn't have to suffer for it. I don't think anyone's saying like you can't write European-based fantasy anymore. It's just, I think a lot of readers are going, we've seen that a lot already, so let's just move on to other things. But I've never heard anyone say it's lazy to write from European fantasy perspective. I don't know. This seems like a take. This seems like an opinion that I don't see a lot of pushback on in the first place. New readers are constantly coming into the market, and what is old and rote for old readers will be fresh and new to them, and you'll always find an audience for whom you'll be in their initial exposure to medieval European-inspired fantasy. If that's your heritage and you love it, write it anyway. I mean, yeah, no one's saying not. I've never heard the take in my entire life, we're done with European fantasy. No more shall it be written. All we're seeing is that there's rising trends of other cultures getting their fair shot to make the main stage of Western fantasy and just fantasy across the world. So I don't know, this is strange to me because we're also still seeing pretty much countless written from European perspective fantasy books come out all the time. We're seeing more hybrids where it's European N+. We're seeing more just purely something else. But this seems to be a take that's pushing against something that's not a problem in my mind. I haven't even seen people talk down to European fantasy. I've just seen people go, yeah, it's had its heyday. Now it's going to be more on an equal playing field as things progress. Not having technological developments in a world where magic already solves 90% of your problems is perfectly fine and believable. Yes, but what I think would be the most believable perspective here would be an extreme differentiation of priorities in technological progression, and I haven't seen an author really dig into that deep. Give me recommendations in the comments down below if you have, because this is something that would fascinate me, a culture where they have progressed technologically in, let's say, the magic system doesn't aid communication. So their communications technological progression is way higher, but let's say their magic solves transportation instead of communication. So their transportation is pretty much like, just have magic transportation. And that also is going to have huge ramifications for other forms of development. Their roads aren't going to need to be as developed, but they're maybe harnessing electricity to then have this communication aspect. I actually really like the idea of that kind of cultural building. It would be a pretty big task to take on, and several authors have done similar things to this. I think Wheel of Time, Stormlight Archive both have elements in there for this. It's just kind of a matter of, if you want to make this a huge focal point, that could be a really interesting story. Humans are overrated and overused. More fantasy and sci-fi with no humans in sight. I entirely agree with this. This is one that drives me up the wall. I'm so tired of humans. I'm tired of not, like, I'm gonna get on my pedestal again, once again, deal with it. We need more classic fantasy races in the spotlight. I want a goblin written fantasy book, damn it. Give me a goblin book. I want to follow that. Give me an elf book. Give me a dragon book. I would love a perspective of a dragon trying to survive in a world where no humans, like their biggest threat is a bunch of dwarves. That would be great. Or come up with your own original fantasy species and things and have them take the reins. That would be fantastic. Humans are boring, man. They're not always boring. They can be amazing. Some of my greatest characters of all time. You know what I mean? I'm just over-exaggerating for effect. Humans are bland. Give me some spicy fantasy species to really mix on up that batch. And that's where I'm gonna go ahead and end this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.